The wind moved lazily through the brittle stalks of dry grass, whispering across the empty fields surrounding the old Granger farm. Fall Creek, Idaho, was the kind of place people forgot existed, unless they were born there, and even then, most tried to forget. The town had one diner, one gas station, and a sense of time that hadn't moved since 1978. It was the kind of quiet that felt less like peace and more like surrender. And at the very edge of town, where the paved road surrendered to gravel and gravel eventually gave up to dirt, lived Harvey Granger. His farmhouse sat like a stubborn holdout against time. The paint had long since peeled to expose grayed planks, and the roof sagged ever so slightly on one side. A rust-red windmill creaked in rhythm with the breeze, and next to the barn stood a row of old, half-functional machinery, tractors, plows, and a combine that hadn't run since Clinton was president. Harvey didn't farm anymore, not really. He bartered repairs for groceries, spent most of his mornings elbow-deep in rusted engines, and his evenings in silence. At 66, he was wiry, leather-skinned from the sun, and kept his long silver hair tied back in a frayed rubber band. His neighbors didn't know much about him, except that he could fix anything with a motor and preferred machines to people. That particular Thursday afternoon, Harvey was crouched beside a tiller engine, cursing at a stripped bolt. Sweat clung to the inside of his shirt despite the fall chill, and a cooling cup of black coffee sat on the fender of his old pickup. He was just about to reach for his impact wrench when the sound of tires crunching gravel caught his attention. Nobody came out this way, unless they were lost or desperate. He stood up slowly, wiped his hands on a rag blackened by decades of grease, and squinted down the road. A sleek black SUV, clearly out of place on the battered path, limped its way toward his gate. It sputtered once, twice, then died completely in a puff of steam and silence, rolling to a stop just feet from his mailbox, a crooked tin box that hadn't seen a letter in years. The door opened, and out stepped a woman. Late 20s, tall, dark auburn hair tied in a knot behind her head, dressed in dark jeans and a green jacket dusted with road grit. She surveyed the scene with frustration, then glanced around and locked eyes with Harvey. "I think my car just gave up," she called out, a note of irritation in her voice. "Can you help?" Harvey considered pretending he hadn't heard. He wasn't in the mood for company, especially not city types driving overpriced cars into his quiet corner of the world. But something in her voice, a mix of annoyance and embarrassment, gave him pause. He stepped forward, motioning her toward the barn. "Pop the hood," he said. She did, and steam billowed up like a broken kettle. Harvey peered inside, expression neutral. "That's not a factory standard setup," he muttered. Brooke Alden watched him with curiosity. "You know a lot about cars?" "I know enough," Harvey replied, reaching in with a screwdriver to test a few wires. "Name's Harvey. This your first time driving something like this through cow country?" She smirked. "Not my first time, but it's not my car exactly, it's on loan." Harvey grunted. "Well, your loaner has a busted power converter, possibly a thermal regulation fault. I got tools, but not parts for a vehicle like this." She looked around, then back at him. "Can you patch it up? Just enough to get me to the next town?" Harvey stared at the mess under the hood and then back at her. "Maybe, but I don't work for free." She opened her purse, but he waved her off. "No money. Trade. You cook?" Brooke raised an eyebrow. "Depends who you ask." "Dinner," Harvey said simply. "You make dinner. I'll fix the car." And just like that, she found herself hauling a pot of beans and rice into a dusty old kitchen that hadn't seen a guest in years. The place smelled faintly of oil and thyme. She moved like someone used to sleek apartments and stainless steel kitchens, now navigating ancient burners and faded cabinets with worn handles. As Harvey tinkered in the barn with her car, Brooke glanced around the house. Old photos lined the walls, a woman smiling in the sun, a younger Harvey in uniform, a high school science fair ribbon, a yellowing blueprint of an aircraft engine signed in pen, property of H. Granger. Dinner was edible. Harvey didn't compliment it, and Brooke didn't expect him to. They sat in silence at the kitchen table, the clink of forks the only sound. Finally, she broke it. "You used to work on aircraft?" Harvey didn't look up. "A long time ago." "Military?" He met her gaze. Civilian contract, for a while. You left? You ask a lot of questions for someone whose car just broke down. Brooke held up her hands in mock surrender. Fair enough. They sat in silence a little longer, then Harvey spoke again. It'll take me a day or two to rig something safe. You can stay in the guest room, if you don't mind dust. Brooke nodded slowly. Thanks. He stood, grabbed his coat, and walked out without another word. Brooke stood at the window, watching the night swallow him as he disappeared toward the barn, flashlight bobbing in the darkness. She had no idea what she'd just stepped into, but instinct told her this man, this grizzled old stranger, knew far more than he let on. And somewhere behind his guarded eyes and rust-stained hands, she sensed something else. This wasn't the first time Harvey Granger had fixed something that was never supposed to be broken, and it wouldn't be the last. The morning sun burned away the last traces of mist from the fields as Harvey wiped his hands clean on a shop rag that had once been white, now stained the colors of time and toil. He stood back and eyed the vehicle parked awkwardly beside his barn. It hadn't moved an inch since yesterday when the woman, Brooke, she'd said, rolled up with a dead engine and a look that said she didn't trust him, or anyone for that matter. The SUV was a beast, sleek matte gray plating, a wide stance with reinforced suspension, and a chassis just slightly too high for commercial models. Harvey had seen a lot of machines in his time, but this one, it didn't belong out here in Fall Creek, not on a dusty trail beside an abandoned wheat silo. Brooke had disappeared inside her SUV, making what she claimed were a few calls, but Harvey figured it was just an excuse to avoid conversation. That was fine. He preferred machines to people anyway. Machines broke predictably. He crouched again and lifted the hood. The engine compartment confirmed his suspicion within seconds. Not only was the hybrid layout unconventional, but the battery mountings were secured with a composite alloy he hadn't seen since his days with Lockridge Aviation. He muttered a low whistle and leaned in closer. No damn way. The thermal insulation wraps around the power core weren't civilian grade, and the heat vent system, it bled off energy with a circular microvent array that had to be a defense application. That meant he followed the wiring to a module tucked behind the firewall and froze. There it was, a signature module plate with serial numbers obscured by carbon scoring, likely on purpose. But Harvey had spent decades reading code-embedded parts, military habit. Phoenix RVX, Series 9, he whispered aloud, classified field prototype. You're not just some farmer, came a voice behind him. Harvey didn't jump, but he stiffened. Brooke stood with her arms folded, her sharp eyes catching the badge he'd just uncovered. She had changed into a clean button-down shirt and jeans, but the sharpness in her voice was still wrapped in steel. I said that yesterday, Harvey replied, brushing past her to grab a socket wrench from his bench. You didn't believe me. That's a prototype vehicle. Brooke's voice dropped to a near whisper. It's not supposed to be in public circulation. Well, you're in public, he said, not looking up. And it's not circulating. Brooke hesitated. Then, what did you just call it? Phoenix RVX Series 9. I worked on its thermal coupling theory years ago, back when those things were still on whiteboards and prototype shells. Now her voice hardened. Who are you? Harvey finally looked at her. Someone who got tired of watching good tech turned into bad decisions. She blinked, surprised by the answer, but smart enough not to push further. He respected that. Do you know why it stalled? She asked finally. Harvey gestured toward a heat sink bundle. Design flaw. Whoever engineered your transitional thermal buffer didn't compensate for resonance overlap in the hybrid modes. That generates just enough microlag to trip the emergency shutdown sequence under the wrong conditions. Brooke stared at him as if he were speaking another language. He sighed. Translation: your fancy SUV gets hot under stress and shuts down to avoid a fire. But if you were in a combat zone, that safety would get you killed. Brooke absorbed the words, and her shoulders relaxed just a touch. You just figured that out? No diagnostics? No interface scan? Don't need all that. I've been building things longer than you've been breathing. She gave a reluctant half smile. So you're some kind of retired genius? Harvey snorted. Retired, yes. Genius, no. just someone who still listens to machines when they talk. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the ticking of the cooling engine. "You hungry?" Harvey asked abruptly. Brooke blinked. "Excuse me?" "I've got a pot of pinto beans simmering in the house. Nothing fancy, just beans, onions, and old habits." Despite herself, Brooke chuckled. "Sure, why not?" They sat in his kitchen under a flickering overhead light, a battered ceramic bowl of beans in front of each of them. The room smelled of garlic, rust, and the faint sweetness of cornbread from a pan that had been scraped clean earlier that week. Brooke watched him over the rim of her spoon. "You live like this every day?" Harvey shrugged. "Got a roof, a stove, and a toolbox. What else is there?" "Maybe people?" He didn't answer, just chewed a piece of overcooked onion and swallowed. "You know," she said more gently, "I grew up around a woman who didn't trust anyone. She built walls out of ambition and lit them with the fire of impossible standards." "Let me guess," Harvey said, "she got rich." "Richer than most countries," Brooke muttered. Then she never learned what it cost her. Brooke stared at him for a long moment. "You talk like someone who lost more than a career." Harvey stood up, poured more coffee into a chipped mug, and didn't meet her gaze. "Not every engine breaks the same way. Some fail quiet, without smoke, without warning." Brooke let the silence fall again. When she finally spoke, it was quieter. "You were in aviation. You worked on classified systems. The Phoenix RVX. Only a handful of people know that designation." "And yet," Harvey said, setting the mug down with a dull clink, "here you are driving it." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "So, what's your guess? Why would someone like me be in a place like this with a vehicle like that?" Harvey took a long sip of coffee. "That's not my business, until you park it on my soil." "Fair." She stood and carried her bowl to the sink, rinsing it under water as rusty as the pipes it flowed through. "Thanks for dinner," she said. Harvey nodded. "And the repair?" "I'll finish it tomorrow," he said. "Need to recalibrate a few things manually." Brooke hesitated at the door. "You could have asked more questions about me, why I'm here, what I'm doing." "I could have," he agreed. "Why didn't you?" He looked at her, really looked this time. "Because if you're running from something big enough to send that vehicle off the road, then sooner or later it's going to show up here too. I figure I'll get my answers then." Brooke nodded slowly. She opened the door, then paused. "You're not what I expected, Mr. Granger." Harvey turned back to his workbench, flipping open a worn notebook filled with sketches and scribbled calculations. "Neither are you, Ms. Alden." He didn't see the flicker in her eyes as she left the kitchen, but he heard the click of her boots on the porch and the faint whisper of wind rising over the fields outside, sharp and restless, like something about to change. The moon had risen high over Fall Creek, casting long silver beams across the dry soil and scattered equipment of Harvey Granger's lonely property. Inside the barn, lit only by the yellow glow of a hanging bulb and the flicker of a portable lamp, Harvey hunched over the open hood of Brooke's vehicle. The SUV's powertrain was unlike anything he'd worked on in years. Beneath its military camouflage paint and carbon-reinforced panels was a marvel of integrated hybrid engineering, cutting-edge and experimental, if not dangerously flawed. Harvey's hands moved slowly, respectfully. Every wire told a story. Every connection sparked a memory. He didn't say much as he worked, but his mind was racing. When Brooke had gone inside the cabin to make a call, Harvey had taken the chance to reach beneath the floorboard of the back seat and remove a slim access panel, hidden diagnostic ports lined with brushed metal and barely legible engravings. Military issue. That much he knew without doubt. He traced each terminal one by one, jotting meticulous notes into a weathered leather-bound notebook. Inside the tattered pages, scrawled among old schematics and unfinished calculations, Harvey wrote down the exact routing of the vehicle's energy conversion system. A diagram emerged under his pencil, lines connecting to boxes, each labeled with codes he hadn't used since his days at the aerospace lab. This wasn't just any hybrid vehicle, this was a prototype. He paused, staring at the half-finished sketch, then quietly whispered to himself, "It's mine. They used my sequence." Back inside the cabin, Brooke was scrolling through the car's digital dashboard. Her fingers danced across the touchscreen, digging into diagnostic menus and navigation logs. A sense of unease crept up her spine. She toggled the GPS system. Nothing. She tried to force a manual override. Still nothing. The locator beacon was dark, not offline, not malfunctioning, blocked. "No signal?" Harvey said as he stepped in, wiping his hands on an old rag. Brooke jumped slightly. She hadn't heard him come in. "Your GPS isn't just fried, it's jammed. High-frequency disruption, probably within a mile radius." "You think?" She hesitated. "Someone doesn't want me tracked." Harvey nodded and sat across from her at the table. "Or doesn't want what you're driving to be found. Either way, it's not accidental." Brooke stared at him, her sharp eyes trying to read the lines of experience etched across his face. "You keep surprising me, Mr. Granger. People do that when you give them the room to be something more than the town recluse." Silence fell for a moment as he set a battered kettle over the stove and poured 2 cups of dark, burnt coffee. Beside it, the pot of leftover bean stew from dinner simmered gently. Brooke looked down at her cup, then back up. "You said you recognized something in the engine. The layout, the design." Harvey took a slow sip, his eyes distant. It was familiar, too familiar. She waited, pressed nothing. He looked up, jaw set. "Back in 2007, I led a small team at Jericho Aeronautics. We were working on cold start energy regulation systems for high-altitude UAVs military grade. Efficient, smart. It was supposed to be the next leap. We developed a prototype circuit routing, precise, safe, and resilient to environmental drift. I spent years perfecting it, filed the patent, got the letter of acknowledgement. Then, 2 months later," his voice faltered. "They filed a second patent, nearly identical, through a different department. Mine was suddenly redundant. They called it an internal overlap and shelved mine quietly. A week later, a test flight failed. Guidance malfunction. The drone nosedived. But it wasn't just a test drone. They had mounted it with experimental payloads." He stopped. His hands trembled slightly as he set the cup down. "They never told us. Never told me. My wife was at the site that day. An audit tech, cross-verifying circuit sequences. When the drone crashed, she was there." Brooke's breath caught. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Harvey looked away, blinking hard. "They blamed a software bug, swept it under, paid me off to disappear. But I know what happened. The system in your vehicle, it uses the same damn routing, same vulnerabilities. They took it. They took everything." Brooke sat in silence, her earlier guardedness softening. "You know who made this car, don't you?" she finally asked. Harvey nodded, but didn't say her name, didn't need to. "Then you know why I can't go back. Not yet." From outside, a subtle rustle passed through the trees. Harvey's eyes flicked to the window. He moved quietly and flicked off the lamp. In the dim light, they listened. Another rustle, a dry twig cracking. Far too deliberate for a deer. Not close enough for an animal. Not random enough to be the wind. "Pack your things," Harvey murmured. "Leave the rest. We're being watched." Brooke opened her mouth, but something in his voice silenced any protest. Whatever they had stumbled into, the edge of it had found them first. The first rays of sunlight crept through the warped glass panes of Harvey Granger's old kitchen window, washing the walls in a pale amber glow. Dust floated in the morning light, swirling gently like memories in motion. Harvey sat alone at the table, nursing a chipped mug of black coffee that had long since cooled. The events of the previous night still echoed in his chest. The car, the girl, the lies, the weight of the past, clawing its way into the present. Brooke was still asleep in the guest room, a space that hadn't seen anyone in years. He'd left a folded towel and a bar of soap by the sink. Beyond that, he hadn't said much. The girl had questions, that much was clear. So did he, and neither of them was ready to answer just yet. Outside, the land stretched wide and empty. The prairie grass was slick with dew, and the worn earth road in front of the farmhouse bore only one fresh set of tire tracks, hers. Then the silence shattered. It started as a distant thump, subtle, rhythmic, almost imperceptible, like a heartbeat just under the skin. Then the tremble grew, rattling the rusted hinges of the barn doors. Harvey stepped out onto the porch, coffee in hand, his eyes narrowing toward the horizon. A military helicopter swept into view from the west, low and deliberate, skimming the tops of the wheat fields like a predator scouting prey. It was matte black, with no visible insignias, sleek, quiet for its size, and moving far too slow to be on a simple flyover. Harvey tracked it with the measured calm of a man who had seen machines like this before, back when he had the security clearance to design them. Brooke burst out onto the porch behind him, her expression tense, eyes tracking the same aircraft. "That's not civilian," she said, voice tight. "That's a Black Hawk, or maybe a Sikorsky MH-60 upgraded. No markings. They're looking for something." Harvey sipped his coffee. "Maybe it's just a training run." She gave him a sharp look. "You don't actually believe that?" "No," he said flatly. "But sometimes saying it out loud makes the wolves wait a little longer before they circle." The chopper veered slightly toward the ranch, banking hard enough that Harvey could make out the figures through the side window, dark silhouettes wearing helmets, one of them holding something that looked suspiciously like a scanning device. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the aircraft banked north and disappeared behind the tree line. Brooke lowered her voice. "They know the vehicle's here. They're narrowing in." Harvey didn't answer. He simply turned and walked back inside, leaving the screen door to bang softly behind him. 15 minutes later, Brooke was pacing the living room, arms folded, eyes darting between the windows. She looked like a cornered animal, clever, calculating, but on edge. Harvey, meanwhile, was back at the kitchen counter, buttering a thick slice of bread with a kind of deliberate stillness. "You're unusually calm for someone being surveilled," she muttered. Harvey didn't look up. "I've been watched before." There was a knock at the front door. Both of them froze. Another knock. Then a familiar voice. "Harvey, it's Ethan Rhodes." Brooke looked at him with alarm. Harvey raised an eyebrow and whispered, "Go to the hallway." "Don't say a word." She vanished without protest. Harvey opened the door to reveal Sheriff Ethan Rhodes, broad-shouldered, sun-browned, wearing his usual khaki uniform and a serious expression under his Stetson. He had a thermos in one hand and a manila folder tucked under his arm. "Morning, Sheriff," Harvey said casually. "You're up early." "I could say the same," Ethan replied, stepping onto the porch. "Mind if I come in?" Harvey gave a reluctant nod and led him inside. Ethan's eyes roamed the kitchen, taking in the 2 mugs on the table, the disheveled cushion on the guest room couch, the faint smell of motor oil, and something unfamiliar, perfume. He didn't mention any of it. "Hell of a sunrise," Ethan said, pouring himself a cup of coffee, "and hell of a low pass over your property just now." Harvey shrugged. "Probably a military drill. Idaho gets those every now and then." Ethan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's the 3rd unmarked bird in the last 2 weeks. This one came close enough to stir the clothesline off Emma Fowler's backyard. Folks in town are asking questions." Harvey leaned against the counter, his posture loose. "And you're here asking mine for them?" Ethan set the manila folder on the table. "Couple of ranchers north of here reported seeing a dark SUV coming through just before the storm hit yesterday. Didn't take the highway, went cross-country, real careful. Could be nothing, could be someone snooping." "Fall Creek doesn't get many strangers," Harvey agreed. "No," Ethan said slowly. "And when we do, I like to know what they're here for." The silence thickened. Harvey picked up the folder and flipped it open. Inside was a grainy satellite image, zoomed in on the dirt road in front of his property. A black vehicle, half obscured by tree cover, was circled in red ink. Another image showed faint tire tracks. Recent. "You think someone's spying on me?" Harvey asked. Ethan took a slow sip from his thermos. "I think you're not telling me everything, and I think you've always been the kind of man who hides a loaded gun in his toolbox, just in case." Harvey smirked. "You say that like it's a bad thing." Ethan's eyes were steady. "Harv, I remember what you were before all this. Before the beard, before the porch rot. You were the guy they sent in to fix what the government couldn't admit was broken. Don't pretend you're just some tinkerer now." Harvey said nothing. After a long pause, Ethan stood. "I've got a town to keep calm. If something's coming, I'd like a head start." Harvey nodded once. "I'll keep an ear to the ground." "Do more than that," Ethan said, heading to the door. "Do what you do best. See it before the rest of us can." As the sheriff left, Harvey watched the patrol truck disappear down the road, its tires kicking up dust behind it. Only once it was out of sight did Brooke emerge from the hallway. "So," she said quietly, "he's no fool." "No," Harvey agreed. "And now we've got a problem, because if Ethan's asking questions, others won't be far behind." She glanced out the window toward the field. "What do we do?" Harvey didn't answer right away. He picked up his old wrench, still warm from the sun, and stared at it like it held the answer. Then he turned toward the barn. "We do what people like us were trained to do," he said finally. "We prepare." The wind outside the old barn had picked up by late afternoon, brushing across the dry Idaho hills like a whisper too ancient to interpret. Harvey Granger sat alone in the far corner of his workshop, an oil-stained thermos of black coffee cooling at his side. Dust clung to the edges of his flannel sleeves as he hunched over the workbench, not fixing anything, just sitting. A rare moment of stillness in a life otherwise defined by motion. A shaft of light filtered through a cracked pane overhead, catching on the rusted metal of an old prototype, what was once the frame of a refrigeration module he designed over 2 decades ago. A soft breath escaped him, almost a sigh, and he let the weight of memory carry him. In the hush of the barn, time peeled back. Once, Harvey had been a rising name in defense engineering, a lead systems designer with Carter and Maddox, a subdivision of Alden Dynamics. He had poured 4 years of his life into a next-generation thermal regulation system meant for unmanned military transport. It was supposed to change everything: coolant efficiency increased by 30%, modular application, redundancy built in. His blueprints had the kind of elegance that came from sleepless nights and inspired breakthroughs. But what had started as collaboration became betrayal. He could still see it. The boardroom that smelled faintly of ink and tension. The long oak table where they'd gathered him for the announcement. Not a promotion, not a patent celebration, a termination notice. Internal audit revealed conflicts in your intellectual property claims, one of the execs had said without meeting his eyes. "It's unfortunate. We can offer a severance if you sign now." The betrayal hadn't come from strangers. It had come from within. Logan Vance, his junior by title but his equal in cunning, had siphoned off Harvey's research files, copied the designs, and submitted them under a rebranded format, just different enough to confuse a review board too lazy to dig deeper. Harvey didn't sign. He took them to court. And he lost. The company buried him under legal firepower. Accusations of misappropriating military-funded R&D followed. His security clearance vanished overnight. Government contracts he wasn't even a part of mysteriously blacklisted him. And then came the worst of it. Mary, his wife, had stood by him through it all, calm, unwavering. She'd packed sandwiches for the court days, kept the lights on by working double shifts at the local pharmacy. They were supposed to make it through the storm together, but a blown tire on Highway 93 during one of her late-night commutes ended that. Harvey remembered the officer's voice on the phone, detached, almost numb. "We did everything we could, Mr. Granger." No one told him that pain could feel like drowning with dry lungs. Now, years later, he traced his fingers along the spine of a yellowed blueprint beside him. Brooks' vehicle, what had seemed like a curiosity, wasn't just a prototype. It was his prototype, cloaked in new armor. The navigation interface she'd been using earlier. He hadn't said anything at the time, but it had struck a familiar chord. That blinking pattern in the diagnostics window, the way the core logic adjusted to temperature fluctuations, that wasn't a coincidence. He reached for his old notebook, the black leather one he hadn't touched in years. The pages were lined with the sharp handwriting of a man who used to believe in systems, structure, and justice. Harvey flipped to a diagram labeled GEN-3NAVFLOW. His thumb rested on the original algorithm code he'd written in his garage before the company had ever funded it. He laid Brooks' sensor logs beside it, traced the overlap with a mechanical pencil. It matched, nearly line for line. So they'd done it again, taken what wasn't theirs, repackaged it, militarized it. And now his work, the work that had cost him everything, was riding in the undercarriage of a young woman's vehicle as if it had always belonged there. Footsteps on gravel outside snapped him from the memory. Brooks stood at the door of the barn, hair tucked into a loose braid, eyes guarded but curious. "You okay?" she asked softly. "You've been out here a while." Harvey nodded, then looked down at the blueprint. "Just remembering." She stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking beneath her boots. "That system you were describing last night, the thermal fail-safe, you said you worked on something similar once." He stared at her for a long moment, then flipped the blueprint around so she could see. Not just similar, identical, down to the coolant dispersion intervals. Brooks' breath caught. "This is from the Alden archives." "This is from my garage," he corrected. "Years before they called it Phoenix Control Firmware, or whatever sanitized name they gave it." Silence stretched between them like tension in a wire. Finally, she spoke. "My mother's company, Alden Dynamics. They've had a hand in Phoenix from the start." Harvey folded the blueprint shut. "I know. You think she stole it?" "I don't think. I've lived it." Brooke crossed her arms, frowning. "Why didn't you say anything earlier?" "Because you needed a mechanic," he said simply. "Not a man with ghosts." The wind outside pushed against the barn doors again, rattling them in their hinges. "And now?" she asked. "Now I'm wondering why a military prototype ended up broken down in front of my ranch," he said, eyes steady. "And why the GPS on that thing was pinging data that doesn't go through civilian satellites." Her eyes narrowed. "You looked at my system?" "I did." She hesitated, then let out a sigh. "Something's not right. That car shouldn't have shut down like it did, and I shouldn't have been that easy to find." Harvey leaned back against the bench. "Which means we're not the only ones interested in that vehicle." The barn lights flickered, just for a second. Then came the sound, faint but unmistakable, the low hum of a drone slicing through the wind. Harvey looked at her. "You feel that?" Brooks' hand dropped to her coat pocket. "Yeah." "Looks like secrets don't stay buried long around here," he said, voice flat. "Neither do ghosts," she replied. The sun dipped behind the rolling hills of Fall Creek, casting long shadows over Harvey Granger's cluttered barn. Inside, Brooke Alden stood by the workbench, her fingers trembling slightly as she held her phone to her ear. The voice on the other end, cool, commanding, belonged to her mother. "You need to come home, Brooke," Margaret Alden said, her tone a mix of irritation and authority. "You're not equipped to handle what you're poking around in." Brooke's jaw tightened. "I found the embedded diagnostics, Mom. The software inside that vehicle, it's not for field testing. It's tracking me." A beat of silence. Then her mother replied flatly, "It was a precaution." "For your safety?" Brooke laughed, bitter and short. "So spying on me is safety? What else have you put in that car?" "You're being paranoid. We'll talk when you're back in DC." "I'm not coming back until I get the truth. About Project Phoenix. About Dad. About all of it." Margaret's tone hardened. "You don't understand what you're doing. If you won't come home, then stay out of this. That's all I'm going to say." The line went dead. Brooke lowered the phone, her hand clenched tight around it. Harvey, who had been silently tinkering under the SUV's hood, didn't look up, but his voice, when it came, was firm. "That went well. She's hiding something big." "She's always hiding something. The real question is why they let you leave with that car." Brooke glanced toward the vehicle, its matte paint now smudged from dust and Harvey's grease-streaked fingerprints. The hybrid engine was fully assembled again, purring with a quiet hum that belied its military-grade complexity. Harvey stepped back, wiping his hands on a stained rag. He leaned into the driver's seat, made a quick adjustment, then slid a small metallic device into the seam under the dashboard. Brooke noticed. "What was that?" "Insurance," Harvey muttered. "What kind of insurance?" He straightened, eyes steady beneath his weathered brow. "Old transmitter, from back when the Cold War was still warm. It'll let me trace the vehicle if it disappears again, just in case." She studied him. You think someone's coming? I think someone's already here. The wind howled outside, sweeping dust against the old wooden doors. The scent of diesel and rust hung thick in the air, but beneath it lingered something sharper, unease. Harvey moved around the SUV, checking the tires, testing the brakes, then opening the hood again and tightening one last bolt. "She'll drive," he said finally. "Better than she did yesterday." Brooke leaned against the fender, folding her arms. "If we leave, they'll know. The second that engine fires up, they'll have us back on their radar." Harvey nodded. "Which is why we go tonight. No goodbyes, no lights. Just tires on gravel, and pray the moon stays hidden." She watched him grab his duffel from the barn wall. Old, sun-bleached, but packed. Already ready. "You were planning this." "No," he said. "I've just lived long enough to know that plans go to hell. Better to be ready when they do." Brooke hesitated, glancing back at the barn. "What about the house?" "Your land." He paused, then looked around the cluttered space. "They already took more from me than they had a right to. This place was just a shell after Mary died. I stayed because I didn't have anything left to move toward. But you—" His voice caught, just slightly. He cleared his throat. "You gave me a direction again." She didn't respond, but the silence between them said enough. Brooke walked out to the SUV and slid into the driver's seat. Harvey followed, throwing his duffel in the back. He took one last glance at the horizon, where the lights of Fall Creek flickered faintly against the darkening sky. Then he shut the passenger door. The engine turned over like a whisper. They drove out slowly, avoiding the main road. The vehicle's lights stayed off, and Harvey guided her along back paths only he would know, routes through old service roads and dry creek beds, where no cell signal reached and no satellite could cleanly follow. An hour outside of Fall Creek, Brooke finally spoke. "Do you think they'll chase us?" Harvey didn't answer right away. He tapped the dash where his old transmitter hummed silently, its signal bouncing off a frequency few still used. Then he looked out the window. "They're not chasing us yet," he said, "but they will, once they figure out we know too much." They drove deeper into the night, two fugitives, not from the law, but from secrets too dangerous to stay buried. The road stretched ahead, empty and uncertain, but at least now they were choosing it together. And behind them, somewhere in the dark, the past stirred, waiting. The morning sun hadn't fully crested the tree line when the deep, rhythmic thump of rotor blades shattered the quiet over Fall Creek. Harvey Granger was already outside, hands coated in axle grease, working on an old baler engine he'd meant to fix for months. But as the first gust of wind tore through the corn stalks behind his barn, he froze. The sound didn't belong to crop dusters or rescue choppers. It was heavier, lower, military. Brooke stepped onto the porch in a borrowed flannel shirt, mug of coffee in hand. Her expression hardened as she turned toward the noise. "Is that—" she began, but Harvey cut her off with a single nod. The black helicopter descended not 50 yards from where they stood, sending waves of dust and shredded corn husks spiraling across the property. Harvey stood tall, jaw clenched, while Brooke instinctively stepped behind the porch's wooden beam for cover. Her eyes searched the horizon. Too many years of watching her mother's security teams had taught her to read patterns. This wasn't a visit. It was a message. The aircraft touched down in the middle of Harvey's backfield like it had done it 100 times before. The side door swung open. 5 men stepped out, dressed in all black, no insignias, no names. Tactical boots, earpieces, close-cropped hair. They moved like soldiers, but Harvey had seen enough of the real thing in his life to know better. These were contractors, the kind who operated in the spaces between law and permission. "Harvey Granger?" the lead man called out, not raising his voice so much as making it clear everyone within earshot should listen. Harvey didn't answer. Brooke reached toward her back pocket, where her phone had been stashed. "Don't," Harvey muttered. "Too easy to misread." The men didn't approach with weapons drawn, but there was a tension in their spacing, the way they spread slightly, keeping the barn, the house, and the field in view. It was the kind of choreography that suggested they were ready for something to go wrong. "I'm Agent Cole," the lead man said flatly. "We're here to speak with Mr. Granger about a piece of compromised equipment that passed through this property." Behind them, the chopper's engine still hummed, the blades slow turning overhead like a mechanical warning. "I don't know anything about compromised equipment," Harvey said, wiping his hands on a rag. "But you're welcome to explain what the hell you're doing on my land without a warrant." Cole smiled thinly, as if he'd rehearsed this. "This is a Department of Energy matter. National security concern. We're invoking emergency authority under the Clean Cybertech Act, Title IV. "That's not how Title IV works," a voice called from the gravel drive. Everyone turned. Sheriff Ethan Rhodes stood at the fence line, one hand resting near his hip, the other gripping the latch. His cruiser was still running behind him. "And unless the DOE started using unmarked helicopters in black fatigues, I'm going to need to see your credentials." Cole's smile vanished. "This doesn't concern local law enforcement. It concerns me when people land a chopper in the middle of my county without notifying air traffic, trespass on private land, and start harassing a civilian without due process," Ethan replied calmly, stepping forward. "ID now." For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. Then Cole nodded to one of the men, who stepped forward and handed Ethan a black leather case with a federal badge and identification card. Ethan examined it, squinting. "This says Defense Logistics Bureau, not DOE, like I said," Cole murmured. "We're here on behalf of a national interest." "Well, this national interest's visit is over," Ethan replied, closing the badge case. "Unless you have a court order, you're leaving this property, now." Behind Ethan, a few townspeople had begun to gather near the tree line. News traveled fast in Fall Creek. A rumbling helicopter landing on Old Man Granger's farm had lit the town's gossip circuit like fireworks on the 4th of July. Harvey looked toward the cluster of neighbors, Tommy Brennan among them, arms crossed, chewing a toothpick with a smirk that screamed vindication. "I knew that old coot was hiding something," Tommy muttered loud enough for others to hear. The black-clad team didn't resist. Cole simply gave Harvey one last glance, eyes narrowing. "We'll be in touch." "I'll be right here," Harvey replied evenly. The group filed back into the chopper. Moments later, the engine roared back to full power, and the aircraft lifted off, sending a second storm of grit through the air. As soon as it disappeared over the horizon, Ethan turned to Harvey, voice low. "What the hell was that?" "Just a misunderstanding," Harvey said, brushing corn dust off his sleeves. "You gonna keep lying to me, Harvey?" Ethan asked. "Because I vouched for you just now, and I can feel in my bones there's more to this than engine parts and old tractors." Harvey looked over at Brooke, who was still standing silent on the porch. "I appreciate it, Ethan," he said, "but there's some things better left unsaid. For now." Ethan held his gaze for a long second, then sighed. "Just make sure I don't find out the hard way. I'll do my job, but don't make me choose between duty and friendship." He turned back toward his cruiser. Before driving off, he added, "You might want to lay low." Word's already spreading fast. And it had. By the time Harvey and Brooke stepped into the town's general store that afternoon to pick up supplies, whispers greeted them from behind shelves of canned beans and dusty hardware. Old Man Granger, black helicopter, government spook, conspiracy. Harvey said nothing. He knew how fast suspicion could become a noose in a small town. And now, with that helicopter's shadow still lingering in the cornfield dirt, he realized something deeper. Whatever he and Brooke had uncovered, they weren't the only ones watching it anymore. They were being hunted. The early morning in Fall Creek brought a thick silence that wrapped around Harvey Granger's barn like fog. The fields lay dormant, save for the occasional flicker of movement in the brush, watchful but distant. Inside the barn, a hanging work light cast an amber glow across scattered blueprints, spare parts, and the open chassis of Brooke Alden's military-grade SUV. Harvey stood over the vehicle, sleeves rolled, hands blackened with grease, eyes sharp as ever. Brooke leaned against the barn wall, arms crossed. She'd been watching him for almost an hour, silently admiring how precise every motion of his was, how the old man didn't just fix things, he read them like stories etched in steel. "Harvey," she finally said, her voice quiet but steady, "I think it's time I told you what you're really working on." He didn't look up, but she saw his hand pause for half a second on the wiring harness before continuing. "The vehicle," Brooke continued, stepping closer. It's not just a hybrid prototype. It's part of something called Project Phoenix. Harvey exhaled through his nose, his version of a raised eyebrow. Sounds like one of those government things that's more classified than it is clever. It's worse than that, she replied. Phoenix is a tactical biological deployment system. They embedded a delivery mechanism within the power core of the vehicle. The engine acts as a fail-safe carrier. If activated, it disperses airborne nanotech, coded pathogens designed to neutralize targets without leaving a trace. Harvey finally turned. Jesus, he muttered. You telling me that hunk of polished machinery out there is a weapon? Brooke nodded grimly. And not just any weapon. My mother's company, Alden Dynamics, built it under a black budget contract. I found the reference by accident while digging through archived project logs. When I realized what it was, I knew I couldn't ignore it. He scratched at his graying beard, taking a long breath, as if the air had thickened with the weight of her confession. That's why your GPS was jammed, he said. They're not tracking you. They're blocking outside interference. Anyone who gets too close to the truth gets drowned in static. Brooke swallowed. You think they'll come back? Harvey didn't hesitate. They already have. That chopper from yesterday? It wasn't a warning. It was a temperature check to see if the eggs cracked open yet. She stepped closer to the engine, her gaze hard. I need to dismantle the delivery system, but I don't know how. They've sealed it with proprietary encryptions and biometric failsafes. I don't need biometrics, Harvey grunted. I need wires, torque specs, and about 6 hours without getting shot. She almost laughed, but it came out as a breath laced with dread. Harvey tossed her a wrench. If you're gonna help, don't just stand there. Hold this. For the next 4 hours, they worked in sync, Brooke handing him tools, Harvey making deft alterations to the internal circuitry of the engine's core system. Each soldered wire, each recalibrated sensor, brought him deeper into the heart of something designed not to be questioned. At one point, he held up a module that pulsed faintly under the barn light. This here is your problem, he said. This component reroutes ignition voltage into a dual-phase capacitor array. That's what triggers the dispersal sequence. And you can disable it? Brooke asked, barely daring to hope. Harvey didn't answer. Instead, he turned to his dusty workbench, pulling out what looked like a 1980s two-way radio casing and a set of circuit boards wrapped in wax paper. I can do better than disable it, he said. I'm going to embed a dead man's switch, a binary loop code that erases the core system and melts the delivery chamber if anyone tries to override the failsafe without knowing the trigger pattern. She blinked. You can do that. With this old equipment? He looked up at her, eyes steely. Kid, I built cooling systems for high-altitude stealth drones using tinfoil and beer cans during test phases. What I can't do with old parts hasn't been invented yet. For the first time, Brooke truly smiled at him, not in amusement or gratitude, but in respect. Harvey Granger, the rough-edged man she'd first assumed was some bitter, isolated farmer, was something far more dangerous and rare, a genius who had been driven underground but never lost his edge. By nightfall, the sun hung low behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the field as they stood beside the now-sealed SUV. Here, Harvey said, handing her a folded sheet of paper, that's your ignition code, 8 digits, hardwired into the modified CPU. Anyone tries to open the hood without entering that sequence first, well, let's just say it'll be their last mistake. Brooke looked down at the code, then back at him. Why help me? Why not just kick me off your property and go back to your quiet life? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked back inside the barn and retrieved a thick, leather-bound notebook, his old engineering journal. He flipped to a blank page and began scribbling down the changes he'd made to her vehicle, wiring diagrams, new fail-safes, even handwritten notes in the margins. When you've seen the worst of what people can do with your work, he said without looking up, you learn to build for the right people and the right reasons. Brooke watched as he carefully indexed the page and tucked the journal away behind a hidden panel in the barn wall. You planning to keep records now? She asked. Harvey gave a one-shoulder shrug. If something happens to me, someone's got to know how to finish what I started. Might as well be the next generation. A long silence passed between them, filled with more than unspoken gratitude. There was trust now, fragile but real. The kind built not on shared ideals, but on shared dangers. From outside, a cool wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of pine and soil, and something sharper. "Someone's coming," Harvey said, eyes narrowing. "We've got maybe 12 hours, Max. Pack only what you need." Brooke nodded. "Where will we go?" Harvey tapped the side of his head. "I've got a place, off the grid. Built it myself after the court case. They can find us here, but they won't find us there. Not until we want to be found." And with that, the old man turned back toward the barn, already planning the next move, not just with his hands, but with the mind of someone who had seen how power corrupts, and how precision could still be used to fight back. The first warning came in the form of a vibration in the ground. Harvey had just set down a welding torch when he felt it, the low tremor beneath his boots. He paused, lifted his eyes to the open barn door, and squinted at the horizon. The morning was still, not a cloud in the sky, but that hum, that rhythmic churn in the air. It wasn't the wind. He stepped outside, shielding his eyes from the sun. Seconds later, the sound arrived, chopping blades cutting the silence, growing louder, sharper, until it was unmistakable. A second helicopter. Brooke appeared from the trailer, her face pale and eyes fixed on the sky. "It's not the same one from before." "No," Harvey murmured, jaw clenched. "This one's bigger." The black military-grade helicopter descended with calculated precision, kicking up a cloud of dust as it hovered over the field behind the barn. It landed without ceremony, blades still spinning. The side door slid open with a metallic hiss, and out stepped Margaret Alden. Her presence hit the air like a lightning bolt. Charcoal gray suit, heels that somehow didn't sink into the soft soil, and sunglasses that reflected everything but revealed nothing. Two men in dark suits flanked her, one holding a briefcase, the other scanning the perimeter like a hawk. But Margaret didn't need an entourage. Her aura alone was enough to silence the earth. Brooke took a step forward, then froze. Harvey didn't move. "You don't get many visitors like this in Fall Creek," he said under his breath. Margaret's voice was ice wrapped in velvet. "Mr. Granger, I believe we have unfinished business." Brooke shoved past Harvey. "You're not welcome here." Margaret turned to her daughter with a slow, measured grace. "Hello, Brooke. I would have called, but I assumed you'd block the number, again." "Because I don't want to be followed by helicopters," Brooke snapped. Margaret ignored the comment and extended a hand toward Harvey. "Mr. Granger, may we speak in private?" "No," Harvey said flatly, crossing his arms. "Anything you have to say, you can say in front of Brooke." A pause. Margaret lowered her hand. "Very well." She glanced back at her aide, who handed her the briefcase. She opened it slowly, deliberately, revealing a thick file stamped with multiple red tabs and the watermark of the Department of Defense. "We've reviewed the Phoenix unit logs," she began. "It's clear that you've made modifications to the original platform. Not only did you identify flaws our entire research division missed, you also created a kill switch protocol that's now being replicated in labs we spent years funding." She closed the briefcase with a snap. "We'd like you to come to Washington, full clearance, access to top-tier facilities, work alongside our lead engineers, help us stabilize the Phoenix project before it's deployed globally." Brooke stepped forward, voice shaking. "You're insane if you think I'm letting him walk into your web." Margaret didn't flinch. "You have no jurisdiction over this, Brooke." "I do when you're using stolen tech," she shot back. "You buried his name on a patent he wrote in his own blood. You destroyed his career, and you think you can waltz back in like this is a recruiting pitch?" Margaret's eyes darkened, just slightly. "I made decisions to protect national security. You made decisions to protect your stock options." Harvey held up a hand, silencing both women. He stepped closer to Margaret, his weathered face unreadable. "Why now? Why me?" "Because the project is falling apart without you," she admitted, voice low. "We tried to replicate your guidance systems, the cooling architecture, the redundancy protocols. Every time, it failed. We need your mind, and I suspect you need a way to reclaim what was taken." He stared at her for a long beat, then asked, And what happens to Brooke if I say no? Margaret blinked. Nothing will happen to her. That wasn't an answer. Brooke stepped beside Harvey, her hand brushing his. It was the first time she'd ever sought his reassurance, and he felt it like a jolt. Harvey exhaled slowly. If I go on my terms, full autonomy, full rights to publish what I want, and Brooke doesn't get dragged into any of it. She's off limits. Margaret's jaw tightened, but she nodded. Agreed, on one condition. Which is? You come now. Silence stretched. Even the wind seemed to stop. Finally, Harvey turned to Brooke. Pack what you need. We're not coming back soon. She looked at him, stunned. You're going? I need to see what they've done with my work, he said, and I need to make sure no one else gets hurt by it. Brooke swallowed. I'll go with you. Harvey shook his head. Number. Not at first. Let me go ahead, see what I'm walking into. Margaret signaled her aide, who stepped forward with a secured tablet and contract file. We can airlift you to DC by nightfall. Your room is ready. A workspace will be waiting. As Harvey signed, he felt the tremble in his hand, not from fear, but from memory, from the cold steel table where they'd once taken his work, twisted it, and killed the woman he loved in the process. He would walk back into the lion's den, but this time, not blind. As the helicopter lifted off, Brooke stood alone, staring into the sky. Ethan arrived just minutes too late, breathless, his cruiser kicking up gravel behind him. What happened? He asked. Brooke didn't answer right away. She kept her eyes on the shrinking dot above the mountains, and finally whispered, He just walked into the fire to make sure no one else gets burned. The temporary government lab in Washington, D.C. was hidden behind an unmarked gate, tucked between a federal records building and an anonymous-looking warehouse near Joint Base Anacostia Bowling. It didn't look like much from the outside, just another slab of concrete and glass. But Harvey Granger knew better. Buildings like this weren't designed to be seen. They were designed to disappear. He walked in with a government-issued badge clipped to his flannel shirt, boots still caked with dust from Fall Creek, and the wary eyes of a man who didn't trust anything with polished floors or fluorescent lights. Inside, the facility buzzed with quiet urgency. Engineers in lab coats, military consultants, and young techs surrounded by clusters of equipment that looked too expensive to exist in public view. They ushered Harvey to Lab 3, a sealed, temperature-controlled room at the end of a hallway guarded by biometric scanners. A dozen engineers looked up as he entered, clearly briefed on who he was, but still surprised to see the man himself, gray-bearded, sun-leathered, and smelling faintly of diesel. This is Mr. Granger, the project supervisor announced. He'll be reviewing the Phoenix prototype systems. No applause, just a tense silence as Harvey set his old leather notebook on the steel table and opened it with a snap. The prototype sat under a thermal canopy, sleek, gray, about the size of a compact SUV, humming with suppressed energy. The same model Brooke had driven across the country, only this one was fully weaponized. Harvey scanned the interface, letting his fingers brush over the console like a blind man reading Braille. Looks like they built it off version 2.3 of the thermal sync protocol, he muttered. No wonder it's overheating on long cycles. A young engineer named Bryant leaned forward. Sir, we isolated the thermal feedback to the magnetic coupler. No, Harvey cut in. It's the dampening field between the kinetic ring and the cooling sleeve. You're bleeding heat because your feedback delay's tied to the ignition timestamp. Shift it to pre-cycle and use a shielded ground. Otherwise, it'll fry itself in combat. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look up. He just wrote a quick diagram into his notebook, tore the page out, and handed it to Bryant. The room went dead quiet. After a moment, someone whispered, How the hell did he see that in 30 seconds? Because I built it, Harvey thought, but didn't say. Instead, he walked to the side table, poured himself a stale cup of coffee, and sat down like a man who just fixed a lawnmower instead of a $1 million prototype. They got to work immediately. Harvey didn't direct, he guided, letting the engineers take the lead, but nudging them when they veered toward wasted effort. The fixes worked. Within 3 hours, the Phoenix unit ran smoother, cooler, and longer than it had since its inception. But Harvey kept the final part of the sequence, the self-authenticating trigger and checksum lockout, quiet, He had it sketched in his notebook, written in shorthand only he understood, stored in 3 places: his head, his journal, and a chip tucked inside the lining of his boot. Not because he didn't want the government to have it, because he didn't trust who'd use it. That night, as the lab dimmed and staff rotated out for sleep or briefings, Harvey sat alone at the edge of the work table, hands folded, eyes locked on the prototype. He wasn't just seeing wires and alloy. He was seeing the same ambition that had once devoured everything he loved. And then Ethan Rhodes walked in. Still in his sheriff's jacket, jeans dusty from the airfield, but with a federal badge hanging from his neck. He looked out of place and entirely comfortable with that fact. "Figured you could use someone who still carries a revolver instead of a clearance badge," Ethan said, dropping into the chair beside him. Harvey didn't look at him. "They send you to keep tabs on me?" "They sent me to protect Brooke." Harvey turned then, really looked at the man. "From what?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "People in suits don't need reasons when the stakes get this high. I heard chatter back in Idaho. Someone flagged Brooke as a rogue asset. That kind of language only ends one way." Harvey exhaled slowly, his shoulders slumping, not with fear, but with the weight of inevitability. "You trust anyone in this building?" Ethan asked quietly. Harvey shook his head. "I trust thermodynamics. And you. That's about it." They sat in silence for a while, the lab humming around them. Outside, sirens echoed in the DC distance, and rain began pattering softly on the roof. "She's not a rogue," Harvey said eventually. "She's a truth-teller with a spine." "And those don't last long in buildings like this," Ethan replied. By morning, the revised prototype was fully operational. Margaret Alden arrived flanked by 2 security agents, her heels clicking like metronomes of authority. She scanned the test results with cool approval, but kept her gaze locked on Harvey. "Well?" she asked. "It works," he said flatly. "You can deploy it, but there's a catch." She raised an eyebrow. "Do tell." "I'm not signing over full systems control," Harvey said, pulling a folded sheet from his journal. "You get operational schematics, but the full destruct protocol, the self-authentication mechanism, that stays with me." Margaret's expression hardened. "You're not in a position to make demands, Mr. Granger." "Then I guess your billion-dollar baby stays in the garage." Ethan stepped up beside him then, arms folded, presence solid like a shield. Harvey didn't need him to speak. His being there said enough. Brooke entered just as the tension reached its peak. She looked between her mother, Harvey, and Ethan, then said coldly, "He's right. And if you think for a second I'll keep quiet while you weaponize his work without oversight, you're more out of touch than I thought." Margaret stared at her daughter, long, hard, and then slowly nodded. "One condition," she said. "You both come back with me to finalize the integration. We do this clean." Transparent Harvey considered her, then glanced at Brooke and finally nodded. "Fine, but I keep the key." Margaret extended her hand. "Agreed." But as they shook, Harvey caught a flicker in her eyes, a sliver of something unreadable. Not victory, not relief, control. And that, more than anything else, told him the storm was just beginning. The conference room at the temporary Alden Dynamics research compound in DC had the clinical chill of a place designed for decisions made in haste, not history. Fluorescent lights hummed softly above, casting a sterile glow over the sleek black table where Harvey Granger sat, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the document in front of him. At the head of the table, Margaret Alden stood in her tailored charcoal blazer, a fountain pen poised between her fingers like a weapon. The document, a thick stack of contracts bound by a brass clip, bore the official insignia of the Department of Defense on its front page. It was a transfer of rights agreement. Signing it would officially place the Phoenix prototype and its destructive potential fully in the hands of Alden Dynamics and its military partners. The culmination of weeks of tense collaboration, silent distrust, and calculated offers. "Harvey," Margaret said with carefully measured calm, "we're all on the same side here. The world doesn't need another war. It needs smart people doing smart things with smart boundaries. You made this possible. Now let us take it from here." Harvey didn't look at her. His gaze stayed fixed on the document, unmoving, unreadable. His hands, scarred, calloused, and oil-stained even now, rested on the table as if weighing invisible tools. Silence stretched. Then he finally spoke. I watched a missile built from my stolen design land on a hospital in 2009, Margaret. You were at Alden even then. You knew what Davidson did to me. You knew who really owned that software. Margaret's expression didn't change. That's not what this is about. You're right. It's not. Harvey slowly lifted his eyes to meet hers. This is about Brooke, and every other kid like her, kids who didn't grow up with corporate lawyers, legacy patents, or Pentagon contracts. This tech could change the world, or destroy it, and right now, it's balanced on a knife's edge. You've had weeks to share your concerns. Now we're at the finish line. Harvey shook his head. You think this is the finish line? It's the beginning, and if I hand this over the way you want, without a single safeguard in place, then I haven't just repeated the past. I've made it worse. He stood, slow and deliberate, and picked up the pen from in front of her. But instead of signing, he slid the contract back across the table. I'm not signing your transfer. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Excuse me? I'll give you the full schematic for the Phoenix power relay, the thermal sink, the ignition lock redundancy, all of it, but only under one condition. She didn't reply, but her silence gave him the floor. I want the creation of a national fund. Call it whatever you want, but it needs teeth. An engineering grant for rural inventors. Hands-on kids from broken towns like Fall Creek, who can't get into MIT but know how to reverse engineer a combine engine blindfolded. I want that written into your defense contract, and I want Brooke to sit on the advisory board. Margaret blinked. You're trying to blackmail a defense conglomerate with a scholarship fund? I'm not blackmailing anyone. I'm trying to make sure my wife didn't die for nothing, Harvey said, his voice rough but steady. You want the design? Fine, but I want fire put into the hands of people who build, not just those who break. A long, taut silence followed. Behind Margaret, one of her aides glanced nervously at his tablet. Another exchange of looks. The old man had just thrown the room into uncharted waters. Margaret folded her arms. You've always been impossible to manage. And you've always believed control was the same thing as progress, Harvey replied. It's not. Let me be clear, she said slowly. The moment you walk out of this room, you're a liability again. You were never easy to protect, but at least here you're within arm's reach. Out there, Harvey raised a hand. I'm not looking for protection. I'm looking for a legacy that can't be bought or buried. More silence. Then Margaret gave a slow, shallow nod. You'll get your fund, in writing, independent trustees, rural focus, and Brooke on the board. But understand something, Granger, this won't shield you, and it won't shield her either. I don't want a shield, Harvey said. I want a fighting chance. She turned to the aide. Draft the revised terms. He leaves tomorrow morning. As she left the room, her heels clicking with finality, Harvey leaned over and picked up the pen again. But instead of signing, he pulled from his inside coat pocket a thin slip of paper, folded and coded, and tucked it into the back of his notebook. The original cipher schematic, written in shorthand, only he could understand. Because no matter how honorable the New Deal might appear, some things were too powerful to leave unguarded. The flight back to Idaho was quiet. No escort, no ceremony. Just Harvey, a window seat, and a sunrise bleeding across the horizon like spilled copper. Brooke was waiting for him at the edge of the gravel drive leading into Fall Creek. Her hair was pulled back, eyes wary, posture tight. She'd been through hell and had come out harder, smarter, but Harvey saw something else too. Resolve. Well, she asked, arms crossed. Did they get what they wanted? Not everything. He reached into his coat and pulled out a sealed envelope. But you got what you deserve. She took it, opened it slowly. Inside, a letterhead from Alden Dynamics, stamped and signed, naming her to the Board of Trustees for a newly formed National Innovation Grant. She blinked, then looked up. You actually did it? I had help. Harvey glanced toward the barn. And a lot of ghosts. As the wind stirred the trees and kicked up the edge of the gravel underfoot, Brooke's voice softened. You could have walked away, Harvey, left all this behind. I did once, he said. Didn't work out so well. That night, in the same garage where Brooke's strange vehicle had first limped to a stop, Harvey set up his old drafting station again. Beside it, a fire crackled in a repurposed oil drum, sending flickering light across the walls. He pulled out the encrypted schematic and studied it one last time before locking it inside a steel box buried beneath the floor. Then, he opened a fresh notebook and began drafting something new. Not a weapon, not a blueprint, a curriculum, a way forward, not just to keep the flame alive, but to pass it on. Fall Creek had changed, not in the way cities morph with skyscrapers and shopping malls, but in the quiet, purposeful ways that matter most. At the edge of town, nestled between wheat fields and rusting grain silos, the old Whitmore garage, once a crumbling shack of oil stains and discarded parts, now bore a new sign: Granger Technical Workshop. The paint was fresh but modest, the heart behind it unmistakable. Inside, the smell of grease and old wood mixed with something newer: coffee, solder, sawdust, and a fresh hope that hadn't existed before. A row of young men and women stood over disassembled alternators, carburetors, and electric drive converters. They listened intently as Harvey Granger, now back in his faded flannel shirt and worn denim, explained the difference between fixing something and understanding why it broke in the first place. "This isn't just about tools or torque," Harvey said, his voice gravelly but steady. "It's about integrity. A good mechanic leaves no guesswork behind. A great one leaves behind someone else who knows more than they did." The students nodded, scribbling notes, but what they really clung to were his pauses. Those moments when he would stare off into the rafters, as if trying to pass along something deeper than diagrams and torque specs. Word had spread across the counties. Kids who had once dropped out of high school or worked dead-end jobs at truck stops came to Fall Creek hoping to learn from the old man who beat the system. Though Harvey hated that phrase, he hadn't beaten anything. He'd survived it. And now, he was building something that might outlast him. Brooke Alden returned that fall, not in the high-gloss SUV she had once driven, but in a modest hybrid pickup, dusty from fieldwork and road trips. She parked by the garage and walked straight into the workshop with a kind of ease that said, "I'm not here to visit. I'm part of this." She wore jeans, a navy windbreaker, and a lanyard marked with the Department of Civil Technologies. Her title now read Technical Ethics Advisor, but to the kids in the workshop, she was just Brooke, the one who could explain encryption protocols as easily as she could rebuild a combustion manifold. "You forgot your own torque values again, Darren," she said over one student's shoulder, tapping his notes with a smirk. "Harvey's going to make you carry that transmission twice just for punishment." Harvey looked up from the far bench and chuckled. "She's not wrong. Better double-check before it doubles your work." They had found an unlikely rhythm, Brooke and Harvey. She had gone back to D.C. for a time, not to work for Alden Dynamics, but to help clean up what her mother's legacy had left behind. She testified in closed-door hearings, worked on federal tech reform initiatives, and even joined a civilian oversight committee. But she never stayed long in one place. Fall Creek had become her compass. Ethan Rhodes stopped by most mornings. Now officially retired as sheriff, he wore jeans instead of a uniform and traded his badge for a clipboard. With help from a local law school's outreach program, he had turned a small corner office next to the garage into the Rural Inventors Legal Aid Center. He provided pro bono consultations for farmers, mechanics, and backwoods tinkerers whose ideas were often stolen by corporate scavengers. "These guys know how to file patents," Ethan would say, "but more importantly, we teach them how to fight when someone tries to take what's theirs." He and Harvey had coffee every morning under the awning beside the garage. No fanfare, no speeches. Just two men who had once tried to keep the world from crushing the people they cared about. That November, on a crisp morning when the frost clung to the fence posts and the sun broke gently through a mist hanging over the fields, Harvey stood alone under the tin awning of his porch. In his hands was a weathered American flag, its edges frayed, its stripes faded from sun and storm alike. He ran a cloth slowly over the fabric, careful not to pull too hard on the thinning threads. The wind lifted slightly, just enough to make the flag ripple. Harvey looked up toward the sky, toward the stretch of open space that had once echoed with rotors and fear, now filled only with birdsong and silence. "Give you a reason to rest easy now, Mary," he murmured, voice barely above the wind. "I did the best I could. maybe even better than I thought I would." He folded the cloth over the flag one last time, secured it back to its place beside the door, and stepped back. The sky stretched wide above him, open, steady, and impossibly blue. Behind him, the clang of tools and the laughter of students echoed from the garage. Life wasn't simple. It never had been. But in Fall Creek, beneath the open sky, Harvey Granger had found what so many others never did: peace, and a reason to believe again. If you've made it this far, then you've felt it, same as we did. That quiet pull in your chest, the ache of old wounds buried under years of silence, the weight of justice delayed but not denied. You didn't just watch a story tonight. You walked beside Harvey Granger through dust, loss, invention, and redemption. You saw how a man the world tried to erase stood back up, not for revenge, but for something much harder: hope. Because stories like Harvey's, they don't come out of nowhere. They come from places the rest of the world forgets: rural towns, rusted garages, and the spaces between broken things where someone dares to make them whole again. If you were moved by this, if it made you think twice about who gets to write the future and who's still fighting for a piece of it, leave us a comment below. Tell us what part hit you hardest. Was it the moment he walked into that DC lab with grease-stained boots and a notebook full of fire? Was it Brooke's choice to stand against her own legacy? Or maybe it was just that quiet second when Harvey looked up at the flag, whispered to Mary, and found peace under the sky. Whatever it was, your voice matters. This isn't just a story. We want it to be the start of a conversation. So talk to us, share your thoughts, tell us where you're watching from, and if you've ever known someone like Harvey Granger, someone quiet, brilliant, and overlooked until the moment the world needed them most. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe, because we're not done. There are more stories coming, stories buried in cornfields, in blueprints, in the dusty corners of small-town libraries and locked government vaults. Stories of farmers, mechanics, mothers, inventors, ordinary people with extraordinary courage. We're building a whole world here, one story at a time, not for clicks, not for noise, but for truth wrapped in fiction, and fiction wrapped in something bigger than us all. So don't miss the next chapter. Hit that subscribe button, tap the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. And if you believe, like we do, that the past is full of voices still worth hearing, and that sometimes the smallest towns hold the biggest secrets, then you're already one of us. We'll see you in the next story. From all of us, under open skies, and we'll see you in the next story.